But for those who I haven't met and don't know me, I was Premier of Victoria up till 8 years ago. I think we're up to now, nearly 8 years. And the state of Victoria, one of 6 states in Australia, we had an early entry into the cladding issue. We've been through a number of phases, really 3 stages of addressing this issue. And I think we've done some things well, uniquely. We've learned a lot. It's proceeding quite well. And we have a situation where there's a general confidence amongst homeowners and industry, and that's a positive. And if we can go to the first slide, please, Catherine. We hope. I just want to stress up front, we have regarded this as a public safety issue from the start. We don't regard it as a legal issue or as a political issue or as a technical issue or a financial issue or a parliamentary issue. It's a public safety issue. It's about public safety, not just for the homeowners, but for neighbours, for people fighting fires, and it's about the human tragedy involved. And some of that tragedy is the loss of value. And that's been the overriding principle for us. Next slide. The reality about combustible cladding is that it's incredibly complex to fix. It's going to take a lot of time. And I know there's some British members of parliament who think they might be able to fix this by June next year. Good luck. It's going to be very expensive. It's inflationary in the building industry. It'll be contentious at time. It's going to require government involvement. Lawyers love it. Insurers love it. It's a litigator's delight. And it is a challenge for politicians because governments of all persuasions have been involved in what I would describe as the building of inappropriate buildings over the last 20 or 30 years. And forgive the language, we say for 20 or 30 years, our industry has been building crap. And that's a problem for all of us. And if you think it's going to go away quickly, next slide, a little reminder. In New Zealand, they've had a cladding issue. It's been going for 20 years nearly, sometimes called the leaky building syndrome or the sick building syndrome. The government had to intervene because everybody else walked away. And if you want to read about it, this book will cover it off. And there's little New Zealand, similar landmass as Victoria, similar landmass as the UK, but a fraction of the economy. And the estimate so far, $47 billion to deal with that issue. And next slide, please. And beyond that, as you've just been discussing, it's not just cladding. The audits involved in Australia have revealed all the other systemic defects. We have, as I said, been building crap. So let's follow the story on cladding and we'll go through the various phases. There've been a lot of fires and the fires continue. Next slide. Next slide. And just as an example, we can go back to 2009 in China, fire with deaths in Shanghai in 2010. We had a fire in 2014, which was really the commencement of our first stage involvement in our central business district, and of course Grenfell in 2017, but those fires continue. And just to remind you, next slide. This is Shanghai, next slide. Dubai, next slide, the LACROSSE fire in Melbourne. And this, as I said, next slide, was our stage 1. And the government in Victoria responded at the time and took some action. And an audit was commenced by our local council. There were some temporary measures put in place and some national meetings took place. And it really came to pass, but the fires continued. Next slide. Again, Dubai. Next slide again. The Marina Tower, the Torch Tower, ironically named. And next slide. Of course, Grenfell in June 2017. And that was the commencement of our second stage. Next slide. And the government responded by advancing the Senate inquiry, and they set up the task force of which I was co-chair. We currently have a Labor government in the state of Victoria. I'm from the Liberal or Conservative side of politics. I was a Liberal Premier, but I was appointed co-chair on a bipartisan basis with a former Deputy Premier of a Labor government. So the two of us from both sides of politics, we also set up a stakeholders group, and there was more work done with the national building ministers, and a pilot audit was commenced. But the fires, again, the fires continued. Next slide. And next slide again, we had another fire in Melbourne. Next slide. At the Neo building in 2019. Next slide, we released our interim report in November 2017. Next slide. That covered a range of issues. I'm not going to go into them in detail. Next slide, we made a number of recommendations, including a statewide proactive audit using some audit tools, and asking Treasury, the State Treasury, to start modelling finance arrangements for fixing. And we produced in that interim report some key findings. Next slide. And I think you'd be familiar with some of those. Next slide. The key to that, system failures at 3 levels: supply chain, culture, and problems with compliance and enforcement. And next slide, we reached a fundamental proposition that it was, one, about public safety, first about public safety, and second about prevent it from happening in the future. Next slide. And when it comes to public safety, you've got to find the buildings first, and then you've got to fix them and fund them. And the prevention is all about the future. So the immediate task was public safety, to find, fix, and fund the buildings. Next slide. And we commenced with a government program looking at private buildings, vulnerable classes. We used planning permits to filter the exercise, trying to find the buildings. We set up an audit tool, and there was this proactive exercise of auditing. And we set up expert panels to risk rate every building that had been found with combustible cladding using international risk rating measures. And the cladding types, next slide, that we covered were the ACPs, but also the expanded polystyrene. So we covered them both. Next slide. We set up a system to do it. Next slide. And in terms of the cohort, we addressed everything 3 stories and above in classes where there were overnight stays. And that's the essential model. We said for commercial buildings, up to the commercial operators and owners to deal with that. Next slide. We said the government would fix its own buildings, and this is part of the fix program, and private fix would focus on extreme and high risk. We had to set some rectification standards, and a lot of work went into that. And we used tools of orders, fines, and various exercises there. Next slide. Part of the fix, it was very evident that it was going to be very complex. Each building's different. They're brownfield. Nobody really wants to work on them. It would require complex arrangements with all the stakeholders, and it was going to take time and going to be expensive. Next slide. Then it came to a question of funding. The government were going to self-fund their own. As I said, the commercial sector would self-fund theirs. And the residential sector, we had some court rulings on the table as to who was responsible. But our owners' corporations, the management companies, were in control, and they were facing bills up to $100,000 a unit. And so before the last state election, the government, in its wisdom, announced what they call cladding rectification agreements, low-cost loans to assist. And I think that probably served a need at the time coming into an election. But the reality is not a single loan was undertaken or accepted by a homeowner. The local councils didn't want to administer them, and asking homeowners to wear a lien effectively on their titles for problems they didn't cause themselves was a completely unattractive proposition, regardless of what the interest rate was. And we recognised then that at that stage that further assistance was going to be needed. Next slide. So it came to how we kept this fine going on. And this is an example of what was a weekly dashboard for the number of buildings that were being inspected, the expert panels that were reviewing those buildings, and the sort of risk ratings that were going on. Next slide. One of the things that became very evident that politicians love to talk about the future, banning products, changing the code, changing legislation, getting different responsibilities arranged, different insurance arrangements. That's all about the future. And that has very little impact on the now and on the fix. And it had very little impact on defective products. And I think worldwide, this has been a problem, that the issue has gravitated to talking about the future and not dealing with the fix. Next slide. We adopted some principles that we would put in place: public safety, risk-based, making sure that everything was signed off, sustainable, best practice, and the insurance arrangements were innovative. Next slide. There was still all the other defects started to come to pass, and I won't go into them in detail, but there's some been very prominent examples in Australia, including structural problems. Next slide was really the beginning of stage 2B, where we released our final report. Next slide. And that covered a range of areas. Next slide. And I won't go into them in detail. We made a number of recommendations in that final report in 2019. Next slide. They included you'll see down the bottom there, a dedicated rectification authority and a government building rectification, all the government buildings being rectified by that authority as well. And then the second column there, you see, we recommended that the only way we were going to get a fix is the government funded first. And that government funding step was bipartisan, and it's proved to be effective. And down the bottom of that second column, you'll see we recommended that the government then use its strength to recover through litigation. Next slide. The other defects that revealed, of course, concrete cancer has been around for a while, but we've seen defects with plumbing, ventilation, asbestos, glass, wiring, as you can see, and many other fire protection issues. Next slide. The government's response to us was to say, all right, we accept your recommendations, and they established what was called Cladding Safety Victoria. The Cladding Task Force, of which I was co-chair, was advisory. Cladding Safety Victoria was an agency of government, independent, funded and established, and its task was to manage and fund rectification, and do so at high and extreme risk. Money from consolidated revenue was put into it, and some money from a levy on all future building permits over a certain size. And it got underway in the very first budget. And we regarded that as a world first program, and it's being continued now. Next slide. And the reality is, where are we up to? There are still fires. The find is continuing. We're still finding buildings. The fix is underway through Cladding Safety Victoria. There's $600 million available, and that's government led, plus the cost of fixing government buildings and the levy, and there's still work to do on the future, and Dame Judith is involved with our committee here looking at the future. Next slide. As for Cladding Safety Victoria, it was formed quickly after our report in 2019. As I said, an agency. Its task is to fix, facilitate and contract, and to fund, and to learn and acquire knowledge and data, and that empower it to take some legal action. And that then takes us to the next slide, which is just some dashboards from Cladding Safety Victoria and their monthly reporting basis, and they're very proactive. That next slide. I'm not going to go into these in any detail, just to give you a sample of the sort of work that they're doing. Next slide. And they're working out new ways of, next slide, of risk rating as well. And they're working out the scope of funded works and preparing information on that basis. Next slide. And obviously, next slide, they're looking also at the implications for insurance in the future. Next slide. As legal issues go, Cladding Safety Victoria has accumulated that experience, the knowledge, the data. It's using the government strength as a powerful force to not only seek resolution, but to seek to take up cases, to recognise the limitations of homeowners being involved. And so those rights have been assigned to government when a fix takes place, and hopefully to act as a deterrent. Next slide. The fires are still going on. Arson in Santiago in 2019. Just a reminder of what can still happen. Next slide. And again, another fire in South Korea in 2020, and there have been others. So next slide. What have we done well? I think early advocacy, those first audits, having an advisory task force which was bipartisan, putting public safety as the principal focus, a proactive search, an audit tool. That audit is comprehensive. The risk rating by independent experts is essential. The establishment of a government agency, the money up front, the continuing leadership, and identifying the other defects. Next slide. What have we learnt? Well, it is about public safety, and bipartisanship makes that work. Proactivity is essential. Risk rating is essential. Cladding is not the only issue, and this is fundamental. Homeowners should not pay, and the reality is they cannot pay. Loans for homeowners or leaseholders in your sex simply don't work, and they won't work. And one of our states has tried loans recently on this issue, and they haven't got any takers either. This will cost much more than most people expect, and it will be essential that the government and industry do the funding. And it's going to take longer than you think. And as I said earlier, it's very easy to talk about change in the future, but that won't fix the current problem. And owners, corporations, leaseholder management groups simply don't have the capacity, the experience, or the funds to litigate. And governments will have to accept the litigation task. And finally, next slide. Doing nothing isn't an option if you want to fix. If you want to fix, avoidance it will just get you into trouble. And if you seek to avoid, you can't fit these things under the carpet. And if you don't fix, people will die. And if you don't fix, people will go broke. And if you don't fix, people will be in terrible trouble. And that makes it a broad public safety issue. And next slide, the final slide. You've got to do it. You've got to find, fix, fund, and it's got to be fair to all the homeowners who weren't responsible. Otherwise, you're going to have more fire. And we used to remind ourselves at every meeting, or have we done enough today so that we will feel comfortable if there's a fire tonight? Because that's the reality. The fires continue and people will die if we don't fix the buildings now. I'll leave it there, Mark.
Ted, I think you got 2 or 3 offers of a job during that talk. That was an absolutely, wonderful talk. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people will recognise things that you said. We're running very tight on time. 2 things for you. 1, can we share your slides with people after the meeting? And 2, can we send you some of the written questions that have come pouring in while you've been talking?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure.